All right, this over here, you may know him, is quite a stereotypical extreme believer. Over here we have quite a stereotypical victim of gaslighting. Now very obviously these two people are not very much alike. So the extreme believer, who is perhaps a member of a cult or of an echo chamber, is usually thought of as confident or even overconfident in their beliefs. Not only do they believe extreme things, they attach faith to their beliefs to a radical extent. They are intellectually arrogant and have inflated or excessive levels of self-trust. Now, all of this is due to how extreme beliefs are typically believed to arise, through processes of radicalization in socio-epistemic environments that echo their own beliefs and sow distrust of outsiders. The victim of gaslighting, in contrast, is usually cast as being singled out, isolated, suffering from severely low levels of self-trust. So gaslighting is often defined as aiming to undermine a person's epistemic self-trust. It manipulates and deceives people into doubting their own perceptions, memories, judgments, experiences, and just general sense of reality. Gaslighting victims are underconfident. Their intellectual self-trust has been undermined to such an extent that their epistemic agency is inhibited. So in psychological terms, gaslighting victims suffer from severe clinical depression. In epistemic terms, because these people no longer consider themselves any kind of epistemic authority or even have any kind of reliability, they have no foundation left upon which to build beliefs. And even if it never gets this far, any successful gaslighting attempts will result in some degree of lowered self-trust. So, at first glance, gaslighting and extreme beliefs seem to be unconnected, or even to be in direct opposition. The victim of gaslighting suffers from self-doubt, whereas the extreme believer is overconfident. And although there is some truth to this analysis, I think, it also obscures the various interconnections that actually exist between these two apparent opposites. I argue that there are at least three roles which gaslighting narratives and narratives of gaslighting can play in the formation and reinforcement of extreme beliefs. First of all, gaslighting can be used as a tool to silence criticism and to silence opposition. Within communities of extreme belief, dissent is not typically welcomed. And one way to put out of existence critical voices is to pathologize individual critics as crazy, irrational, or paranoid. These are typical gaslighting dismissals, and they also serve to deter any other potential dissenters. Now, oppressive regimes or ideologies, like for instance white supremacy, can also sometimes preemptively silence resistance by dehumanizing and pathologizing the oppressed. They will typically have dominant narratives in place which justify the domination as well as the suppression of any opposition. Cults are also known to gaslight their members. For instance, the New York-based cult NXIVM, which ceased operations only a few years ago when its highest-ranking members were arrested. Now, this was really a mix of a self-help group, a multi-level marketing scheme, and a cult. And part of their programming was to tell members to distrust their own instincts, their own gut feeling, their own intuitions, especially if they felt fear. They also told members that there is no such thing as abuse, and in fact, no such thing as a cult. Now, this programming would later be used to manipulate members into having sex with the cult leader. It worked preemptively because the sex was framed as a personal challenge to be overcome by the members. And when some members finally did protest, they were told that their fears or their hesitation were just leftover obstacles that they needed to still overcome. Now, a second role that gaslighting can play is to be used instrumentally to pave the way for strong leadership and radical beliefs. So typical gaslighting strategies include sowing confusion, disorienting people by overwhelming them with information. Now, I have argued in a 2021 paper that in the political arena, similar strategies can actually be observed. For instance, when the Kremlin spreads disinformation, counter-narratives about the war in Ukraine, or the crash of the MH17 flight. Now, these counter-narratives are often inconsistent. and they lead to a sense that it is hard to know what to believe anymore. But here, the feeling of disorientation and a loss of self-trust is usually not the end station. As Peter Pomerantsev has also argued in the context of Russian disinformation, such confusion often goes hand in hand with a need for new clarity, new grip on reality. Populist politicians and autocrats are very skilled at presenting themselves as answering this exact need, a need they are often partially responsible for creating. So the leader might be seen as some kind of epistemic authority, or as a representative of some deeper truth. And this is also echoed in some things that QAnon members have said about Donald Trump. He may not always be correct, but at least he speaks my language. You should take him seriously, not literally. And on a somewhat smaller scale, extreme belief systems and cult-like communities can use similar strategies of instrumental gaslighting. So the gaslighting in the Nexium cult was effective at silencing dissent, but it also created this kind of disorientation, a disorientation that the cult itself was then supposed to solve. If you still feel confused, you should probably do more. Take more very expensive classes. Start teaching those classes yourself on a voluntary basis. Rise through the ranks. And the cult leader presents this kind of ultimate enlightenment. By taking all his classes, spending all your time with him, you might reach a similar insight and a similar psychological stability. So in both cases, the ultimate goal is not so much to have you doubt yourself or to destroy yourself completely, but the self-doubt is a means toward control. So the self-doubt is sometimes only partial or intermediate in order to prepare you for becoming part of this inner circle of strong believers. And those insiders might in some sense have high self-trust, but in another might not, and might in fact be very deferential and uncritical towards certain others, like again, the leader. And a third function is that narratives of gaslighting can serve to legitimate and insulate extreme beliefs. Now, importantly, there's a difference between gaslighting narratives and narratives of gaslighting. So the former is perpetrating gaslighting, and the latter is just accusing others of gaslighting, so just using the term gaslighting to frame others. And Shane and others describe how, for instance, the alt-right engaged in this kind of framing. They claimed that there was widespread election fraud in the 2020 US presidential election, and that this fraud was then covered up by Democrats, by mainstream media, and some never-Trump Republicans who were gaslighting the public about this widespread fraud. For instance, media would deny that there was fraud and discredit supposed evidence that QAnon supporters had found. Now, to be abundantly clear, this is a false use of the term gaslighting. Regretfully, however, this term is abused more often, so that some now believe that we should give up using the term altogether. I think that would be a waste, personally. Now, more importantly, false narratives of gaslighting are meant to shut down debate, to discredit opposition, to discredit counter-evidence. And such claims of gaslighting by outsiders can further reinforce dogmatism, radicalization, and imperviousness to counter-evidence. In conclusion, then, I think there are at least 3 ways in which gaslighting narratives or narratives of gaslighting can play a role in extreme belief formation and reinforcement. First, they can be a tool to silence criticism and opposition. Second, they can undercut self-confidence to create a need for stronger leadership. And third, narratives of gaslighting can serve to legitimate and insulate extreme beliefs. I do not think these categories are necessarily exhaustive. There are perhaps other ways that gaslighting can be used to support extreme beliefs, nor are these categories perfectly separated. For instance, it's possible to imagine a case where a narrative of gaslighting is used to gaslight itself. So, for instance, a group of climate change deniers might claim that a socialist elite is trying to gaslight everyone into denying their common sense beliefs. For instance, they might say, weather is changeable, and in fact, there was a snowstorm just last week. And all the citizens who are denying this are just sheeple. And this claim of gaslighting could in fact then work to have people questioning the effects of climate change that they have perceived, and the trust that they have in climate scientists. Still, the distinction into these 3 categories can be helpful, I think, as a first step to acknowledge the various ways in which gaslighting and extreme beliefs can be interconnected. Now, there is a few important upshots of this conclusion, I think. For starters, these two phenomena are clearly not as distinct as they may seem at first glance. There are various, quite complex interactions between gaslighting strategies or narratives and extreme belief formation. In fact, I think these interconnections are much more complex than I can do justice to here in these 10 minutes. Moreover, the role of self-trust in extreme belief formation is not straightforward. Lowered self-trust can be an intermediate phase in the process of acquiring extreme beliefs, enabling radicalization, and heightened self-confidence in later stages. Finally, the possible roles of gaslighting raise questions about responsibility for extreme beliefs. Extreme beliefs are sometimes thought to be the result of culpable individual epistemic vice. However, on the contrary, philosopher Kate Abramson, talking about gaslighting, suggests that gaslighting actually turns a victim against herself, in a similar way as torture does, forcing her to become complicit in her own manipulation. And this suggests that extreme believers who have been victims of gaslighting should perhaps be understood as being, in a way, blamelessly complicit. At the same time, it also suggests that perhaps bolstering people's epistemic agency can empower them to resist gaslighting and also some forms of radicalization. Thank you.